if American and British collective consciousness could be undermined by targeted advertisements like this, holy we have a serious problem. And we do. Like, we have a much larger problem than Cambridge Analytica. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, our lack of education and our lack of interest in like teaching people how to do critical thinking, it has unironically created a national security concern. There's a couple of videos that
in early
I've been meaning
2020,
to watch.
I started
You Are
becoming...
Witnessing the Death of American Capitalism is something that everybody said was really good. So yeah, we're going to do that right now.
Increasingly interested in finance. I know. Ugh. But this was mostly trying to make sense of the logic behind what the Federal Reserve did in response to COVID, which I'll get into later. But the more and more I learned, the less and less it made sense. So I started deeply analyzing stocks from companies that I was personally and professionally familiar with, such as CuriosityStream and Spotify, which led to me starting a private fund that strategically shorted those companies. I even ended up getting hired as a freelance consultant for venture capital firms. Me, a musician with no higher education whatsoever. And the more time that I spent looking at and studying the big picture, the more that I doubted myself, as if the only two options were option A, me being unable to understand what every 25-year-old day trader understands, or option B, I'm right and every hedge fund manager and billionaire is wrong. But what if there's a third option? What if capitalism's death wasn't a mistake or something that the ultra-wealthy were trying to avoid? What if the pesky burden of labor laws and taxation could be avoided by deprioritizing the goal of financial profit, or maybe even money itself? This video is going to explain or explore what I and an increasing number of economists think is happening or has already happened.
Hey, yo! 1 minute and 16 seconds in, Giannis Vargas mentioned, what the hell? Okay, I'm already invested. I don't know anything about this guy, but very cool.
To capitalism. More importantly, I'm going to try to encapsulate the unsettling socioeconomic reality that we're living in, as so much has happened in the last decade that it seems foggy to us.
Ben Jordan is a fantastic music creator. He has a good band and usually covers music, fun stuff. He made a video and called himself a libertarian, but I'm 90% sure he's like Chomsky style.
You can't fairly describe capitalism without mentioning its predecessor, feudalism. And feudalism was a power structure in kingdoms where wealth was defined by the control of land rather than money. And our history books tell us that feudalism ended sometime in the late 15th century, but there's a much more recent version of it that would be a much better example for the purpose of this video. When the Civil War ended, or when the first American Civil War ended, depending on how far into the future you're watching this video, a lot of former slaves were offered a deal where they could continue living and farming on the same land where they were slaves in exchange for a portion of the crops. In many cases, they would only be able to sell their remaining crops through the plantation store, and with that income they could participate in trade, which would allow them to buy more tools and negotiating power in hopes to eventually buy land for themselves. By the late 1930s, 2/3 of sharecroppers were actually white, and the Great Depression had shut down enough farms that many of the tenants migrated to large cities to become factory workers. It would be important to note that sharecropping is not technically outlawed today, it's just that American capitalism's growth made it obsolete. The former definition of capitalism is a system in which individuals and private parties control the means of production, and profits are the key driver of economic activity. And it's important to note that within a closed...
If you adequately describe capitalism, it is virtually impossible for you to not come across as a socialist. That is precisely what Das Kapital does as well. The class dynamic described and the inherent contradictions within the capitalist organization of the economy is not supposed to be a criticism of capitalism. It's just supposed to be descriptive of capitalism. This is a reality that a lot of people don't understand, which is why so far this person is describing capitalism correctly, which is why he might come across as, in the words of DJ Academics, kind of like a socialist.
You're also kind of borderline teetering on what would most people say is socialism, my guy. Like,
wait, what? Let me tell you something about myself then. I don't give a shit. Yeah, I don't think that the capitalist organization of the economy is adequate. Teetering on the edges of a socialism kind of guy.
System with no new variables, capitalism's success can almost exclusively be measured by the velocity of money. The classic example is the farmer and the mechanic. This tiny economy has $50 total. The farmer trades $50 to the mechanic for tractor repair, and then the mechanic trades $40 for corn from the farmer, and then buys a barn cat for $10 from the farmer. And in this cycle, $100 has changed hands, so the velocity of money is measured as 2. This is calculated as the velocity within a time period equals the total sum of transactions over the total of money in that economy. In a larger modern economy, the classic way to increase the velocity of money is to reduce interest rates, but when spending becomes reckless and leads to higher prices and reduced currency value, the classic move is to make borrowing more expensive. Governments around the world either control or have a lot of influence in interest rates, and some people think that because of this, the Federal Reserve should be abolished. And nobody could predict exactly what would happen if the Federal Reserve was abolished, but it would almost certainly result in a lot of turbulence in the market that would leave a lot of victims in its wake around the world.
A really useful way to understand how wealth is distributed is to stop using money as a commodity and use something that people actually use or consume. Let's say a can of Coke Zero from a 12-pack. A person with $100,000 in a traditional investment fund like Vanguard would come out to about 312,000 cans of Coke Zero in 2019. That same investment, untouched, is worth about 330,000 cans of Coke Zero now. So sweet. 18,000 cans of Coke Zero for free. Now, on the other hand, a person working for minimum wage full-time in Iowa would have made 43,360 cans.
I'm sorry, but this is fantastic. I think he's doing a great job describing capital accumulation versus wage labor, a distinction between the capital owning class versus the wage laboring class, and how one's wealth will grow even during periods of stagnation, regardless of what kind of input that they have in terms of labor, in terms of the work that they put into it, whereas the other will not.
Cans per year before taxes in 2019. Today, in 2025, they're making 22,177 cans. Somehow, this person got a 49% wage cut, while the person with the market fund got free soda. Amazingly, through the miracle of inflation, the money decreases in value for everyone, while the actual wealth itself moves up to the top.
The concept of the stock market was proposed in 1792, but it wasn't until...
By the way, that right there is at the heart of the wealth disparity that Americans experience and constantly complain about. And that is precisely the reason why that other dumbass yesterday, when talking to Sam Cedar in the Jube debate, was talking about how, well, the top marginal tax rate actually paid a larger share of the overall taxes after they had their taxes cut. And it's like, yeah, dude, because their overall net worth exploded. What you're supposed to look at in that process is the effective tax rate of the individual, okay? Or the average effective tax rate for the top 1% versus the 99%, the bottom 99%. Or even better, look at the top 10% versus the bottom 90%, okay? That's what's significant, not the fact that they paid an overall larger share of the taxes. Of course, they paid an overall larger share of the taxes because they made a ton more money. Was the overall net worth that they accumulated in that process adjusted? Was that 4% swing simply a 4% swing for them, or was it significantly higher?
1830, when the first stock was sold on the New York Stock Exchange. It was initially filled with railroads and banks, but by the next decade, everybody with a business idea wanted to have their name listed. This rapidly stimulated both technological and economic growth, and by the end of the century, the middle class was getting more and more familiar with investment. By the 1920s, you might be seen as a fool for not being involved in stock trading. In fact, you might be seen as a fool for not borrowing money to buy stocks. Many middle-class investors were borrowing with a 1-to-3 ratio, meaning that they would borrow $300 for every $100 they invested. This sounds absolutely insane, but it didn't seem as risky due to the introduction of futures. In the mid-1800s, the Chicago Board of Trade had a pretty great idea to make grain trade a lot more reliable and a lot less volatile. Rather than grain farms having to guess what demand would be at the end of the season, they could sell it at a discount in advance.
A future is not a stock or share, but a contract guaranteeing a future transaction. It just so happens that I have a whole bunch of healthy female chicks who will shower me with more eggs than I know what to do with in about 3 months, and I really could use a little bit of extra money to build an addition to their coop so they could have room.
If you hate capitalism, then get rid of all the money you have and go live like a socialist. So tired of rich people calling for socialism is they're actually on people's side while profiting off the fools who follow them. And if you say you're not rich, my eyes are going to roll out of my head. Capitalism isn't bad, consumerism is, and you support societies that literally treat women like property. So you are word doesn't mean much. I think regardless of how stupid you are, you should still probably get health care. Whether you want it or not doesn't really change the dynamic for me. I still think you deserve free health care. And a free college education, as a matter of fact. Perhaps you would at least be able to fill your brain with information rather than the coins that are jiggling up there in an empty tin can.
Room to run around with and be healthy egg layers when they become adults. So you, being an opportunist and a capitalist, can buy my egg futures off of me and then sell eggs to restaurants in the summer at a profit and make money without ever having to shovel the heaping amounts of chicken.
You obviously haven't lived in a society with universal healthcare. I have. It sucks. I grew up in Turkey, a much poorer country than the United States of America. And let me tell you, okay, public health existing, like a national healthcare structure existing, even though there is also still private insurance in Turkey, is still wonderful. It was a wonderful thing. Anyway, that's always funny though. People who are like, you don't understand, universal healthcare sucks. You should probably stop eating shrooms.
That I'll have to shovel. All right, let's go back to the 1920s.
By 1919, due to the popularity of futures and people's willingness to borrow money to buy them, a farmer could get $2.09 for a bushel of wheat. This was inflationary to say the least, and even made the sharecropping economy I mentioned earlier more desirable for a brief period of time. It started getting really out of hand, so the Grain Futures Administration was formed and implemented a large mandatory daily ledger and reporting system for traders. The U.S. Secretary of Agriculture would repeatedly suspend the reporting system, creating more volatility and more opportunists taking advantage of that volatility. Then, in October...
Were you an adult in Turkey who had to pay taxes and you're rich and your family is rich, so don't pretend you understand the impact of those taxes? Yeah, rich people famously love paying taxes. Yeah, it's actually a very common advocacy from rich people to advocate for higher taxes so you can pay for social safety nets for the poor. Famously, that's what rich people always advocate for. You don't even make sense in your own mind, dude. You're just fighting your own internal demons right now. That's why I'm saying I'm going to be authoritarian, okay? I'm going to be authoritarian right now. Let me tell you something. I am going to, in an authoritarian manner, I'm going to force free healthcare on you. I'm going to force free healthcare. That's sweet, sweet free healthcare on you. It doesn't matter if you don't like it. You're going to be like, no, I want to die to curable, treatable diseases. I want to die. I'm like, no, you're not. You're not going to have medical bankruptcy. I don't give a f you like it or not, okay? You get to have no say in this process. I'm the dictator. And you know what I'm dictating? For you. Don't give a f. You can complain about it all day, every day, but you're going to get it. And you're going to get a free college education as well. And an opportunity for a jobs program, okay? A federal jobs program where you can have great benefits on top of that. You can say, I don't want it. No, I hate those things. I don't care. Yes, that's going to happen regardless. And you know what else I'm going to do? I'm going to punish the wealthy. I'm going to punish the super wealthy, corrupt capitalists, okay? I'm going to punish them. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you sell spoiled baby formula knowing full well that it was spoiled? Guess what? You're going to jail. Oh, I'm sorry, Sackler family. Did you actually create a massive opiates crisis? Well, guess what? We're not giving you a slap on the wrist, okay? You're going to prison. You're going to prison. Doesn't matter if all the poor people in the chat are actively saying, no, we're going to defend the Sacklers and their honor. Excuse me, sir, you can't do that. That sounds a lot like authoritarian communism or whatever. It's going to happen regardless. That is my dream, okay? Whether you like it or not, you're getting these things. You're getting these benefits.
Of 1929, as there was more money out on the loan than there was circulating in America at the time, and as more wheat was being produced than the population could ever hope to eat, the elephant in the room woke up and took a giant shit on the floor. Everybody tried to get ahead of the crash, which more or less caused the crash, and by the end, a bushel of wheat was only worth 49 cents. And for the next 12 years, capitalism was a failed experiment. Well, wait, actually, for the next 20 years. We like to think that capitalism made its great comeback during the Second World War, but by today's standards, that was, I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to say this word in public anymore without being arrested, communism. But we didn't just go from the freezer to the frying pan immediately. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal founded the SEC to protect investors moving forward.
I don't think it was communism, but I do think that it was the closest that America has ever come towards central planning, the war economy, 100%. Like the New Deal is the closest that America ever got to being a competent social democracy. And we're basically eating off of the remainder of that, of all of those policies from back then. It's pretty crazy to think about. The closest America's ever arrived at, like, even development, things of that nature, rapid industrialization, rapid growth. Man. All right, let's
introduced the Social Security Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act and prohibited child labor while securing a national minimum wage and workers' rights to unionize. Successful fellows with even a fraction of the wealth that Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos has would have paid a 79% income tax, and companies like Tesla and Amazon would have paid a corporate tax rate of 15%. But the C word wouldn't come until the US got involved with World War II. To say that the war efforts...
Segregation was a thing. Yeah, I know. But it's also silly to bring up segregation in that regard when we're talking about economic policies, because it didn't factor in to central planning in terms of, like, they could have not done that and still did all of these policies, and America objectively would have been better. Okay? You're right. It is obviously consequential. It's very impactful. It's something worthy of tremendous amounts of criticism. Okay. And it actually played a hurdle in the even development, like in the project of rapid urbanization. It literally was a burden. America's racism got in its own way once again. So that part of the story is important to address. It's not something that I, cast aside. But as far as like the policies that were implemented at the time, like, racism did not actually make the policies better. You know what I mean? It's not like if we had abolished segregation at the time, like, it simply would not have worked. To me, I feel like this is no different than. To me, I feel like this is no different than saying, well, Nordic nations are small and homogenous, and that's why they make it work. Like, no, that's not the case. It would have been more bountiful if we were to address the historic wrongs of white supremacist racism, chattel slavery, and segregation at the time. Nip it in the bud. America would objectively be a better place right now. First of all, I don't think white supremacy would be as successful as a button to push that Republicans push all the time. But if we're talking about central planning, like, people who bring up segregation in that process unironically make the I guess reverse side of the same exact argument that, like, dummies make about Norway, where they'll say stuff like, well, Norway is homogenous.
Stimulated the American economy would be a vast understatement, but this was under a closely guiding hand from the federal government, and it was every free market capitalist's worst nightmare by today's standards. Many companies were told what they would be producing and how much of it they would be producing.
Yeah, ironically enough, the anti-black racism and white supremacist attitudes, of course, was a very common way to attack communism as well, which is... this is, according to Central Committee, the campaign post for CPUSA, Communist Party of the USA, in 1930. Communists have historically been on the side of equal representation and have been, I guess, dare I say, woke. That is precisely the reason why a lot of people attacked Martin Luther King, and many individuals, some of which had more radical political perspectives than even MLK himself, as communist agents of the USSR, as a matter of fact. Some of them were literally Maoists, like the Black Panther Party, but overall, Black American history has, dare I say, more socialist, communist, anarchist, Maoist figureheads than capitalist ones. Isn't that crazy? You never learn about that in school. Isn't that wild? Like, if you hear about it at all, it's usually under negative terms, like, oh, Malcolm X was violent, you know? Like, don't listen to him. He was violent. He was not a good guy, or whatever the they teach in American school. They even say MLK, it was good because he was peaceful, and they completely whitewash his political ideology and his background. He was an anti-imperialist. He was a socialist as well. Interestingly enough, either black figures, revolutionary figures, are immediately whitewashed or undermined and considered to be bad and wrong. It's actually really interesting when you think about it. Perhaps there's deliberate reason for that. Anyway, let's continue.
And how much they would be paying their labor force. American citizens got ration books and stamps and were only allowed to buy specific amount of staple consumer items like bread and sugar. And if you wanted to buy a car or gasoline, you had to justify a need to the government. Most consumer items that came in metal containers, which was like everything back then, could not be purchased again unless you recycled the container first. This rationing more or less lasted until 1947, and into the 1950s, fellas like Elon and Bezos would have had their income taxed as much as 92%. And again, yes, in modern times, this sounds like a capitalist's worst nightmare, but it resulted in a 37% growth over the next decade and made America the richest country on earth. It is now literally referred to as the golden age of American capitalism. And despite a few brief bumps in the road, things just kept growing and growing and growing exponentially, making us richer and happier and... In the early 2000s, capitalism got so complicated that investors didn't fully understand what they were buying, and that's not an exaggeration. This was by design. There were trillions of dollars to be made by obfuscating what commodities were being sold in your average stock market transaction. A great example, everybody watching this has heard the term subprime mortgage, but I'd guess that not everybody knows exactly what it means. It means a risky mortgage. If you've ever purchased a house, you may have witnessed the wild auction that takes place without your consent or knowledge the moment you sign the mortgage papers, and the average mortgage is sold 2 to 3 times before it's paid off. Here's an example of a 2005 style mortgage. It's an expensive house. It had ninja verification, which means no income, no job or assets. The credit score is around 500, and it has an 8% or higher interest rate. That's an ARM loan, meaning that it will be adjusted to the market in the future. The delinquency rate of a mortgage like this in 2008 was 25%. So anyway, if you want to buy it, I'll just take 2% of the overall value, and you'll still make a bunch of money when the loan is paid off. Why don't you want to buy it? Hang on, I have an idea. Let's make this a little bit of a safer bet. Let's mix it up with some other mortgages here, and I'll get somebody who depends on me for business to give it a rating. And then we can just call it a mortgage-backed security, which is a type of bond. And it's a bit like a future, but it's even better because you can exit the investment whenever you want just by reselling it. Now look at this. If that little risky mortgage forecloses, the loan will still be backed by all of the others. And I bet you can't even make out which one was the original loan. And this isn't like some risky stock. This is an investment on housing and land. And you and I both know that God ain't making any more land, right? It is the bedrock of American capitalism, and it's a safe place to put your money. It's gone. A lot of batshit insane things happened in the 2008 financial crisis. I bet you could probably make some really successful Hollywood movies about it.
Object to the test!
Good. Ultimately, in just 6 months, the Dow Jones lost 54% of its value. Massive banks perished. Washington Mutual, Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Lehman Brothers, to only name a few. We needed another new deal before people's bank accounts were wiped. And this time, we tried something a little bit different.
These are not normal
Neoliberal deal.
circumstances. The market is not functioning properly.
Instead of doing something utterly reckless, like revamping and updating laws to protect workers or creating programs to help the middle class so we could be, on par with the rest of the developed world, we figured that if we just gave $700 billion in bailouts to banks, that money would trickle down and more.
It's really cool that we did another version of this during COVID because we just simply don't have... I guess we did have an existing system to be able to get to virtually every single person. It was just far too terrifying to use it. But even our payment structure was divvied out by way of the PPP, which was a way to, instead of utilizing the postal services or the IRS to figure out where the need was and to reach virtually every single person with direct cash infusions, we thought, oh, let's just give unconditional loans that we will forgive later down the line to whichever company says they have employees. Because there's, after all, no other way that we could technically give the money directly to the workers. Also, if we were to give money directly to the workers, that would be scary. You would be incentivizing them to not work. As long as companies said that they were going to take that loan from the federal government and give it to their workers, then that's a good idea. Let's just give them money. Okay? Let's just give these companies money with the hopes that if they do a pinky promise, that money will somehow make its way to the employees themselves. Really cool stuff we did there. Oh, wait, turns out that was also devastating. I'm obviously jumping over his point because he's basically talking about the older version of this in Obama's neoliberal New Deal, where instead of directly helping all of these Americans that were over with predatory loans, we just, gave the money to corporations instead. We bailed out the banks and we bailed out big businesses without any sort of significant assurances that they would actually help the workers in the process.
More or less accomplish the exact same thing. Now, you're never going to believe this, but it did not. Ultimately, while unemployment and foreclosure skyrocketed, the banks experienced a generous heaping spoonful of socialism. And to pay for this, we borrowed money and we printed money. In 2006, the Federal Reserve printed $148 billion in currency. By 2012, that number had increased to $380 billion. The inflation was immediately reflected in home prices and even more so in the great, awkwardly socialist rebound of the stock market. In 1994, Jeff Bezos was a hedge fund manager who wanted to start an online bookstore, which was already a hard pitch at the time. Why would anybody want to buy books online when they could just go to the library? But it was even worse. He was allegedly transparent to his investors and told them that he intended to prioritize growth over profit for a very long time. All in all, he had 60 meetings offering 1% of ownership for $50,000, and the biggest investors were his parents buying up 6%. With 22 investors, Amazon.com got off the ground with $1 million. By 1999, Amazon was selling everything from books to DVDs to household goods to electronics, and soon after, the company transitioned from being a retailer to an online gateway for other retailers. Amazon customers could pay a low annual membership fee for unlimited free 2-day shipping, and both retailers and manufacturers began to become dependent on that convenience. Retailers weren't the only ones with a dependency problem. Here's 3 stats that will probably fuck up your whole day. By 2021, it was estimated that 60% of the US population were part of an Amazon Prime membership. It is now estimated that only
This is why I've regularly advocated to allow Amazon to basically suck up the rest of the competition and become a pure monopoly in every sense of the word, even though it already is in the field of e-commerce, and then nationalize it. Nationalize Amazon, okay? Chinese style. Make Amazon Chinese. Do you understand how sick that would be?
1% of Amazon Prime members compare prices with other online retailers. And incredibly, while Amazon refuses to confirm this, there are thousands of reports of people finding examples where prices for the exact same products are higher for Amazon Prime subscribers. Does that sound like free market capitalism to you? Walmart had to resort to emulating Amazon's business model in an attempt to keep up. A decade ago, Amazon had surpassed Walmart's market cap, despite Walmart having over 10,000 massive theme park-sized stores worldwide. Walmart is far from the only company trying to mimic Amazon's growth and choke point strategy, and that's a vast understatement, as fast scaling and blitz scaling has become a normal game plan for startups. The definitions vary a little bit, but fast scaling generally means to prioritize growth initially with an open-ended plan to make a profit later. So for example, if I wanted to fast scale a lemonade stand, I would make a pitch deck for venture capital investors that proposed selling lemonade at 50% of what it costs for me to make it. This would
literally using underhanded tactics and taking advantage of extra money that you have to monopolize and consolidate any market whatsoever, and then slowly but surely, once you have created almost complete corporate consolidation by way of one company or 2 companies or 3 companies where you can engage in the act of not illegal price leadership as opposed to the very illegal price fixing, you can just slowly turn it up, turn up the dial year over year. And then you got people going, why do I have to pay for extra baggages? Why am I having to pay for a luggage, carry-on luggage? I didn't used to have to do that. What the hell is going on? Oh, food is no longer free on the flight. Okay, got it. Wait a minute. Seems like the seats are getting smaller. What the hell is happening? You know, that sort of thing. That's another heavily, that's another marketplace where there are direct monopolies in certain flights, or an oligopoly, an effective oligopoly where it's like 1 or 2 or 3 companies. It's also an industry that is a natural monopoly anyway. Airlines, there's a massive overhead, like a massive natural barrier of entry to enter. Anyway, let's continue.
Grow my customer base significantly and starve out the neighborhood children who I'd be competing with. And then once I disrupted the lemonade market successfully, I'd work out a volume deal with lemon plantations and lower my costs while slowly raising prices for the customers so a profit could be realized. Blitzscaling, on the other hand, is a lot more reckless and assertive. My VC proposal would be to sell lemonade at half the cost, but buy out all of the neighborhood children for their stands. And then I'd buy some lemon plantations and I'd pay $100 million to have the local football stadium renamed Benn's Lemonade Stadium, and every person in attendance would be given free lemonade if they downloaded my app. You may be asking how on earth that would ever make a profit, but we're gonna figure that part out when we've dominated 80 to 90% of the lemonade market and have millions of lemonade drinkers. Right now, we just need to concentrate on disrupting. That probably still sounds like a terrible investment, but if you buy into the initial seed round of the investment, you'll have the opportunity to sell that equity at a premium in a Series A or Series B, or even better, during an IPO launch when the company enters the stock market valued at, I don't know, $15 billion. To investors in this stage, it's much less about profit and more about a lucrative and risky game of hot potato. An excellent example that we're all familiar with is Uber. Here's the original pitch deck proposing the disruption of the taxicab industry. It's nearly delusional, claiming that a city's medallion system for cabs is a monopoly and that licensed cab drivers paying for the medallions have no accountability. In the future, digital taxicab hailing can make, I guess, lifting up your hand unnecessary. And when they say luxury, they mean prestigious vehicles like used Priuses. And these Priuses driven by non-employees who sign up can be used to drop your kids off at school or transport the elderly. Uber has had over 25 rounds of funding that it has used to...
So much of Silicon Valley companies revolve around disruption language. Aman korkuttun lan. Oh, ay be. What was I talking about? So much of the disruptive ways in which these guys work is basically undermining pre-existing regulation, whether that be labor laws by, contracting everybody. What happened? No, it's just my mom who wanted to walk Kaya. And like I was saying, so much of that is basically disruption is just a code word for the evisceration of pre-existing regulation. That's all it is. Like, if you have to employ people, then you have to pay for their benefits. But now you can actually disrupt that market by having contractors that are unaccountable.
Raw dog its way into the cab economy and pay for everything from lobbying local governments to settling hundreds of lawsuits. Naturally, once the traditional cab industry was more or less destroyed, the prices got jacked way up, and between 2018 and 2021, the average price for an Uber ride rose 92%. Those early pre-seed investors who unloaded equity when the company went public will obviously never have to work again. Public investors did not fare so well, and the great Uber IPO launch crash shit show made some of us think that maybe finally people are learning not to be bullish about companies that have an annual operating income of negative billions of dollars. And despite this, by 2019, the American stock market gained an impressive 30%. We're back, baby. While COVID is a hot topic for debate these days between scientists and cult members, let's try and remember how utterly terrifying 2020 actually was for us. The economy obviously screeched to a halt, and many industries have still, and probably never will, fully recover as society was forced to change their economic habits. And while the stock market initially crashed in 2020, within 1 year, it had risen to over 30% of its pre-pandemic levels despite the economic apocalypse happening around the world. This is because on March 23rd, 2020, the Federal Reserve announced that it would be launching a bunch of new programs like the Primary Corporate Credit Facility, which would buy new corporate bonds, and other programs that would buy existing corporate bonds, mortgage-backed securities, and asset-backed securities filled with student, car, credit card, and business loan debt. The federal fund effective interest rate dropped to 0.05%. And all of this was before any person or local government received so much as a dime in relief. The following month, the CARES Act was announced, which was a free $1,200 check sent out to every American making under $75,000 a year, regardless of their circumstances, with no questions asked on how or where it would be spent. This would be the first of 3 such checks that Americans.
I still have my check somewhere with Donald Trump's name on it. I never cashed it, or I might have cashed it. I don't remember. Which is why it's funny, because everyone's like, Hasan, you've always been so wealthy. You were born 6'4" and also unimaginably wealthy. And it's pretty funny because, like, yeah, I got a COVID stimmy, dumbass, because it was off of what your 2019 tax returns were. Like, of course, people don't understand that, but
citizens received with a federal tab totaling $814 billion. And for those of my viewers who have been longing for an explanation for the massive increase in hammock sales that year, now you have your answer. These stimulus checks were just a tiny sliver of the overall $5 trillion that the American...
They're gonna be like, Hasan engages in tax fraud but while being a wealthy gorillionaire and still getting COVID stimmies from Trump.
Government spent on subsidizing the economy, and you would be right in assuming that the list of recipients was outrageous. Airlines received more money than SNAP or food assistance programs. Payroll tax exemptions got more than housing programs and farmers combined. Massive loans and grants were given to the likes of Kanye, P. Diddy, Jared Kushner, the Church of Scientology. But more importantly, for the purposes of this video, a huge portion of that money went to fintech lenders, investment firms, and venture capital groups like Andreessen Horowitz, which was immediately repurposed into investments into a new, rapidly growing type of economy that some economists refer to as To help properly explain post-capitalism, I need to remind you of the utter absurdity of just having $1 billion. Not only is it impossible to spend on even the most lavish things that you would desire, but it's also very much not like having a garage full of cash. For example, if Elon Musk, with his value of $450 billion at the time of me recording this, if he negotiated a deal to buy South Africa with its total gross domestic product valued at $381 billion, he wouldn't be able to afford it due to the value of his holdings dropping significantly as he liquidated the equity. If 13% of Tesla's shares immediately went for public sale, it would create an enormous surplus and the company's value would crash. All net worth does is obfuscate things. Cash is only powerful when you're broke, and it's only valuable when you need or want something that you otherwise couldn't get without cash. What I instead want my viewers to be concerned with is your personal levels of power or control over the things that you earn, consume, and trade. In 1996, the US stock market had around 8,000 companies listed, and since then, our economy has grown by over $25 trillion, and now our stock market boasts nearly 4,000 companies. In that same period of time, the number of listed companies around the world went from around 24,000 to 51,000. So what is happening here? Why would our variety of public securities drop by 50% while the rest of the world's doubled? The term private equity means more or less what you would expect it to mean. These days, it's usually a larger company or firm that buys smaller companies and either transforms them from public companies to private companies or just keeps them as private companies, as opposed to a publicly traded company that has a lot more obligations with the Securities and Exchange Commission. In the 1990s, it was estimated that about 2% of the businesses in the US were owned by private equity, and that number has since grown to over 25%. And this includes includes everything from chemical companies to farms to vets to
Awesome.
grocery store chains to food delivery apps to gyms to medical facilities to drug companies. And many of these related businesses are owned by the same investment firms or their partners, which sets the stage for an entire gallery of anti-competitive business practices and tax shielding using tactics like dividend recapitalization. In fact, this is almost unnecessary these days, as a newer trend is private equity firms literally giving one of their portfolio companies a value and then selling it to themselves. But the classic private equity business model is borrowing and raising as much capital as possible to buy and sell companies at a profit. And the faster this process is done, the better, as this beckons the velocity of money demonstration that I gave you earlier in this video. You can argue that these are just complex capitalist maneuvers, or perhaps late-stage capitalism, a term that's been used since Werner Sombart coined it in 1928. But even that is not happening anymore. The velocity of these transactions is slowing down significantly, and the average private equity holding time is the longest that it's been in 20 years. The COVID stimulus and the market effect from it led to an enormous boost of acquisitions in 2020, and even though we're now
Hey gamers, this is also making video games gay, all right? Just remember that. It's making video games homosexual.
past the median average private equity holding period of 3 to 5 years, exits have been stagnant. What's more alarming is that in 2020, many workers proved to corporations that they don't need to come into the office at all, which also proves to corporations that many of them can be replaced by labor by anybody in the developing world who speaks English. That is a private equity investor's wet dream, so what gives? Does nobody like money anymore? The point of all of this maneuvering is decreasingly about turning a profit and increasingly about transitioning to a rent-based economy that hedges inflation. Right after the 2008 financial crisis, investment firms started betting big on farmland, typically hiring local farmers to manage them, but more frequently offering leaseback programs where the farmer continues working but rents the land, ultimately losing control over their working budget and circumstances. Otherwise, since then, and especially since 2020, in almost all cases, investment is not attracted to innovation or profitability, but to business models that act as a middleman offering subscriptions to products or services you would otherwise buy directly. For example, software, movies, video games, parcel, pizza delivery, headphones, cell phones, groceries, clothing, underwear, heated car seats, pregnancy. A rent-based economy has always been present in real estate, but if you're an American homeowner, then you've probably had an annoying amount of investment groups asking if you'd like to sell your house. And it's not unusual for those investment groups to pay over market value for single-family homes. It also shouldn't surprise you to hear that homeownership has been declining, particularly for millennials, with nearly 2 out of 3 people under the age of 40 being renters. Many argue that this is primarily due to inflation and sluggish wage increases, but the cost-to-income ratio has risen for renters and dropped for homeowners. The wealth gap between renters and homeowners has widened by over 50% in the last decade. In lower and middle class households, white people are nearly 2 times more likely to be homeowners than people of color, meaning that younger minority groups are likely to be increasingly disproportionately punished in the future when you take all of this data into consideration. Profit and even money itself is only really valuable when it buys power. And if a societal system can be engineered to gain power without profit or money, capitalism begins to exist as something to exploit within that system under its umbrella. It sounds hyperbolic, but it needs to be said a lot more often. Most of us do not realize that we are in a constant battle with billionaires who don't want us to own things, but rent them. And when we don't own things, we lose control over our own budgets, lives, decisions, and ultimately our own destinies. Here's a pertinent example. Did somebody that you know send you a link to this video, or did you type in Ben Jordan new video and find it that way? Or was it recommended to you by an algorithm? Or was it placed on...
Or maybe a third party radical Twitch streamer is watching it in front of his audience in real time.
On your sidebar, or did it autoplay when another video ended? This next and final chapter is very much about the type of transaction that you and I are having right now. Me working without benefits, guaranteed pay, or protections to make something to use as bait to get you to either watch targeted advertisements or pay $14 a month without even being offered a chance to indefinitely play the video file offline on your own device. And while you do that, your every move is being harvested for data to empower the company. Let's take a look at this definition again and let me know how well it describes our little transaction here. Capitalism is formally described as an economic system in which individuals and private parties control the means of production, and profits are the key driver of economic activity. Long before the pandemic, the foundation had already been laid for an economy that transcended goods and services. Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal, where 87 million users were psychologically profiled without consent and served political ads, was hugely associated with both the 2016 presidential election and the Brexit referendum. Many people believe, including whistleblowers who worked in the data centers, that without Cambridge Analytica, the UK would still be part of the European Union. Better yet, here's a leaked debriefing slideshow from Cambridge Analytica giving themselves credit for using mined personal data in combination with misinformation campaigns to win an election. As Americans,
For me, I think, wait, what is this? Edit, I get it, we don't like sponsors. Let me clear something up. Fundraiser for UNICEF Ukraine. This video isn't anti-capitalism, and Ground News is transparent about their methodology, which is vetted by third parties. It's not a comparable business model to news aggregators. We're not getting paid any more or any less if you sign up as a CPM deal. Finally, this puts me in a rough spot. I don't normally work with sponsors for the many reasons the grievances outlined in the comments here, but pulling this will cancel a whole lot of aid for people who desperately need it. I've had plenty of fundraisers and none of them perform anywhere near as well as me working with a sponsor. This video isn't anti-capitalism. I mean, whatever. Sure. Okay.
Americans were concerned and distracted by claims of voter fraud.
Wink. I will say this much. My position on Cambridge Analytica stuff is that, like, if American and British collective consciousness could be undermined by targeted advertisements like this, holy, we have a serious problem. And we do. Like, we have a much larger problem than Cambridge Analytica. Do you see what I'm saying? This is what I said even back when the Russiagate conspiracies were popping off. Like, our lack of education and our lack of interest in, like, teaching people how to do critical thinking, it has unironically created a national security concern. And since that happened in 2016 and then onwards in the UK after that, I promise you things have only gotten worse. We're actively doing it to ourselves on a daily basis. We literally let a billionaire take control of Twitter, which was, you know, not the most popular social media platform, but still it was a pretty sizable social media platform. And clearly that has had tangible impact on political discourse and American consciousness in general. So things are bad and getting worse. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is saying that he's going to abolish Department of Education next week. So there's some cool stuff there too to look forward to.
Fraud and hacked machines, we forgot to notice that democratic elections don't work when news and information are no longer democratized. For example, in most dictatorships, the government will have an office that permits or denies which stories can run in the newspaper. In 2025, every piece of news that the average voter sees is manipulated by a third-party aggregator. Even if you go to something like Google News and select the generalized headline areas, your feed will be different than mine. This disequilibrating of information was concerning enough when it was being done for ad revenue and profit. But now, it's about a lot more than that. Whether capitalism is healthy or unhealthy at any given point in time, it has always provided the framework for negotiation between profit and labor. In Karl Marx's critique of political economy, labor is broken into two subcategories. There's abstract labor, which is what I'm doing right now when making this video. I'm learning, I'm gaining experience, I'm sharing information, and overall I'm just feeding my passion. And the other is concrete labor, which is what somebody would be doing if they were holding a boom mic over me or making me coffee. Capitalism obviously requires concrete labor, but it thrives on abstract labor as it provides organic growth. And the problem is that you can't just snap your fingers and get abstract labor. You can't even buy it because someone's passion and happiness is more valuable to them than a commodity. So corporations classically try to generate it through morale-boosting corporate programs and retreats and parties. This has been a major challenge since the Industrial Revolution, even when you're paying a competitive salary, health insurance, 401k, and bonuses. But when you hire gig workers that have no benefits, labor protections, or even guaranteed income, which, by the way, is often below minimum wage, how can you expect to extract abstract labor? And abstract labor and value is extremely high in creative industries. How can you expect musicians to, on average, spend more in fees to give you their music than you'll ever pay them in royalties? How can you expect an app or game developer to give you 30% of their income when you're not even offering support or advertisement? Or shit, how can you expect somebody to buy thousands of dollars of camera equipment to start a competitive YouTube channel? Okay, other side of the coin. Why would I, a YouTuber, take a modest salary to produce, shoot, and edit short stories for, I don't know, the New York Times, when I can have full control over my content where I'll be rewarded appropriately for all of my hard work? Or why would somebody work for a chauffeur company when they could set their own hours depending on how much money they needed in any given week? According to YouTube's 2024 Culture and Trends report...
Okay, I wouldn't compare those two things. One, you are contracting yourself as a gig economy worker. On the other one, like working for the New York Times as a gig worker would be closer to Uber.
65% of Gen Z identify themselves as a content creator. And YouTube doesn't exactly hide why this is such good news for advertisers who intend on capitalizing on this societal snowball effect. But we can assume that if and when that generation enters the labor force, they won't exactly be bringing high levels of abstract value to the car insurance claims adjuster cubicle. But this is nothing new. Long before the pandemic, the labor force participation rate had dropped significantly from its peak in 2000. And you can see the decline growing exponentially as big tech entered the economy. It obviously crashed during the pandemic, and now, even though labor force participation was at a 35-year low in 2019, we still haven't even recovered to that level. Meanwhile, in 2024, 36% of US workers were participants in the gig economy. It is projected that by 2027, that number will have grown to over half of the entire American workforce. I wonder what could possibly make everything that I told you in this chapter 100 times worse. In the late 1990s, we quickly realized how powerful marketing could be with the innocently named cookies, which simply track a user's activity with the primary goal of optimizing targeted advertising. When Facebook introduced the like button in 2009, the power of sentiment analysis was realized, and it would only be a few years before you telling your aunt that you bought a new grill would lead to you seeing ads to get you to subscribe to meat subscription services. Hey, look, there's a coupon for the annual plan. Congratulations, for the next year of your life, the meat you grill will be chosen for you. It won't be graded like the meat you get from the butcher, it won't be FDA approved, and you'll pay more while a farmer on the other side of the world earns less. But it wouldn't be until the recent AI boom when sentiment analysis would become sci-fi levels of terrifying. Facebook has lost popularity while young users migrated to Instagram and TikTok. Now, to participate in your social group, you are required to create content. And when you do that, AI analyzes the sentiment of the content, and if it's not saying or showing anything that isn't of interest to the platform, for example, talking about a government coup on TikTok, then it is viewed by users who have shown interest in that topic. The content would then be graded by the amount of time that users would spend looking at it before moving on to the next photo or video. And the higher it scores, the more people it's shown to. And once it's graded as a useful video, it is shown to people who are most likely to feel rewarded by watching it. An algorithm priority and optimized placement in this cycle can be purchased at a premium, in which case TikTok also takes between 10 and 15% commission of a sale. So if I wanted to make some edgy, catchy t-shirt that said, I don't know, "Rip Capitalism," for example, and sell it in this vacuum of an economy that TikTok has, I'd go through a drop shipping service like Printify, who would then act as a middleman for finding a printer. And Printify, of course, offers a subscription too, and they make money from both the printers and the designers. In this cycle, abstract labor is either unpaid or paid pennies on the dollars in comparison to the wealth that their labor generated. This isn't exactly a speculation or a prophecy either. As of 2025, 1 out of 3 young people have shopped on social media in the last week, and another study of 14,000 global consumers has shown that 91% of people prefer buying cosmetics on social media. 81% of the people in that study prefer buying clothing that way, while only 57% even bother trying clothing on before purchasing them. And again, one could argue that this is merely capitalism on methamphetamines, but a store like Kohl's employs 96,000 people. Printify employs 760 people. Kohl's sales have declined for 11 consecutive quarters, and it can be expected that their payroll will shrink along with it. The reason I'm using clothing as an example here is to show you how powerful sentiment analysis is at converting consumers to this new economy. 15 years ago, if you proposed the idea that the value of a video app would be higher than, I don't know, seeing how your clothing looks or fits on you before buying it, you'd be laughed at. The majority of the income from these everyday transactions adds up and now goes to firms that were subsidized with venture capital. And I can only imagine that being an actual manufacturer is less and less desirable, which may additionally explain why labor participation is at historic lows. In the last 2 years, as AI was being shoved in my face virtually everywhere, as I'm sure you have experienced as well, my Google searches now open a sidebar telling me about my previous search that I don't have patience to sort out. Or if I want to make sure that a replacement vacuum hose works with my model of shop vac on Amazon, instead of searching through reviews and answers, I now have to talk to a bot named Rufus about it. This is happening with emails, with messaging apps, image editors, everything. I was initially really confused by this because virtually nobody likes it. It changes familiar workflows of users, which risks somebody leaving your ecosystem. And it's really expensive. Just one round of training an LLM or large language model can cost over $200 million. And that's not to mention the hugely increased processing power that needs to be done every time that you query that model. And all of this is just happening automatically just to beg us to use it. Why? The reason that so many cloud-based companies are dumping so much money and resources into pushing this technology on everyone is to capture the part of our routine that comparison shops or researches or asks for advice or arrives at a logical conclusion about something. If you become friends with ChatGPT or Gemini or Rufus or Siri, and you consult with their vast informational resources on a more personal and casual level, you're not only supplying them with the purest form of sentiment analysis, but you're helping them build a system that will further control not only your decisions on what to buy or subscribe to, but what hobby you'll take up next summer. Not only is it influencing your decision on where to buy an engagement ring or where and when to go on vacation to propose to your partner, there's nothing stopping it from influencing your decision on whether you should get married at all. It would be very naive to think of digital assistants as your assistants. They are very much not there to help you, but to help their owners. And the conclusion that most of us has is that they're there to help their owners make more money. But in the case of things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal or Twitter quite literally and intentionally becoming an interactive right-wing propaganda tool, there's a lot more to be worried about than money. What we ultimately have is money being extracted to systems that do not grow or scale the way a capitalist system does, by expanding the assembly line or opening more chain restaurants or researching and patenting a new type of refrigerant. And I am personally convinced that the market will crash again and more money will be borrowed and printed that will ultimately be invested into the further transformation into a rent-based economy. During World War I, America's debt to GDP ratio was 35%. In World War II, as we strained every single resource that we had, it skyrocketed to 121%, meaning that we had 21% more debt than value as a nation. Our debt to GDP ratio once again skyrocketed after the 2008 crisis, and it just kept rising. And right now, we are at 123%. Higher than it has ever been in the history of our economy. Our national debt as of February 2025 is $36.5 trillion, and our total debt is $102 trillion. I would say that we're well past the point of no return, but I don't even know what that is because this is so unprecedented. And I assume that it would be easier to change the value and concept of money than it would be to repay that level of debt. And it's worth pointing out that the primary owner of that debt isn't China or Japan or even our own Federal Reserve.
I don't have a problem with this aspect of debt, especially because that's not how the American government works. The confidence that people have in the dollar comes from the fact that it is the global currency in which trade it takes place on, and also the fact that it's the American military that defends said global currency. So in that sense, it doesn't really matter. I mean, another great example is like during World War I, right? I mean, World War II when it skyrocketed. What matters to me is that in the World War II era, the way that all of that expenditure was distributed was significantly better than what it is now. That's the issue, in my opinion. The issue with American debt is not necessarily the fact that it's so vast, it's so large, because America is still at this stage the global hegemonic superpower. I'm not like a debt guy at all. I think a lot of the conversation that people have around this oftentimes revolves around like fiscal tightening, fiscal austerity, belt tightening initiatives. But in reality, I think the real issue is not the fact that we have such vast amounts of debt, especially because that's not undermining the confidence that people have in the dollar or the American economy as a whole, but it's how we have distributed those resources, and it entirely stays at the tippy top. It never yields benefits for the American working class. That's the issue.
It's U.S. investors. As this cycle continues to snowball, money will be less and less valuable, not only because of inflation, but in principle. When the government is so closely entangled with the people who have benefited the most from this mass extraction of wealth from a capitalist economy, it stops making sense to think of wealth as money. Hear me out. Here's a helpful metaphor from the book Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. There's a story where Stalin and his powerful entourage of officials was traveling by motorcade when they came across a peasant woman struggling to push her cart up a hill. Stalin saw this and ordered the cars to stop and inquired about her situation. He wanted to give her some money to help her, but not one person in his entire entourage had a single ruble of cash on them. And that's because their wealth was in ideological power and influence. They didn't need cash because no matter how lavish their appetite, whatever they desired would be given to them. It wasn't until the deeply organized experiment of communism fell that the Soviet ruling class had to convert their wealth to a tradable commodity as oligarchs. Unfortunately for oligarchs, money can't buy everything. Money alone can't change laws. It can't force people to dress the way you want them to dress or to identify in a way that aligns with how you see them. It can't make ideologies against the law. It can't allow you to change the race, culture, or ethnicity of your neighbors. You can't buy someone else's choice to be or not be a parent, to graduate or transcend from those unfathomable limits of what money's wealth can get you. You need to control the power of information so that you can manipulate the world that you live in. And I believe that is exactly what's happening, and unfortunately, I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. If you've stuck with me this long to listen to and consider my entire manifesto here, thank you. And all I ask is that you consider the information in this video when you make personal decisions, read the news, or spend your precious time on this planet participating in the post-capitalist economy.
I suppose you want some advice on how to educate yourself about current events when an exceeding amount of news organizations are owned by billionaires and sometimes even governments. Well, Ground News. Come here, I'll show you. It's an app and website that collects news articles from around the world and organizes them by political bias, reliability, potential conflicts of interest,
ethical reacts.
Media ownership. Ground News themselves are independently owned and funded by subscribers like myself.
Yeah, I understand why he said he's not anti-capitalist.
Monitoring organizations. So here's an example, one that'll probably be a sequel to this video. Trump announces strategic crypto reserve, including Bitcoin, Solana, XRP, and more. That's from CSNBC. It's owned by the Roberts family. Very high factuality, center bias. Let's head over to the right, shall we? Trump moves crypto strategic reserve forward. Promises to elevate it. Fox Business, owned by a media conglomerate, the Murdoch family, high factuality, and it leans right. All right, going left. Trump's crypto reserve is a payoff for loyalists. Published by Fast Company, which is individually.
Guys, I don't need to watch a Friendly Jordy's video to tell you my opinion on Ground News, but I'm not going to shit on this person whose video I just watched and thought was very good. As he's in the process of like showing their
owned high factuality,
their Ground News sponsorship.
Left. But my favorite is the blind spot feed, which shows you news that the left or right is just completely unaware of. For example, left-leaning news organizations don't seem too interested in telling you that the EU spends more money on Russian energy than Ukraine aid. And unsurprisingly, right-leaning news organizations don't really want to tell you about an analysis that shows that Trump tariffs will cost the average US family $1,600 or more more per year. Anyway, if this is something you're interested in, you could go to the link below or go to ground.news/Ben. And if it jives with you, that link also gets you 40% off the Unlimited Vantage plan, which will probably be the cheapest subscription that you use. And once again, just like last time, proceeds from the sponsorship will go to UNICEF Ukraine, which delivers essential supplies and education to the most vulnerable in war regions. Children. Just because our leaders have given up on them does not mean that we have to.
This video took a lot of research and fact-checking and was an immense, intimidating, long-term project for me that very few of my viewers expected, much less asked for. Despite all the fact-checking that I did, a lot of this video is kind of philosophical, and I'm open to being wrong. I do think that what I said in this video is worth consideration, as there are some very real statistics and scenarios that will affect your life in some way, shape, or form. But most of all, I want to thank you for your valuable time, and I also want to thank my supporters. Videos like this are part of my nonprofit and are almost always funded by viewers like yourself through Patreon. And if you'd like to support future videos and be part of an amazing, healthy, and inspiring community, then we'd love to have you. Ironically, it's another damn subscription service, but it's a worthy one, and you can join for as little as $1.
All right, this is politics.
I suppose since we're talking about the S word so much, I should probably tell you where my little political flag is stuck. I'm actually a libertarian. Not the poser libertarian who doesn't think that trans people should exist in Bann's books, but the one who thinks that you should be able to do whatever you want as long as it isn't infringing on somebody else's freedom. Now, this would be a much longer video that probably doesn't even belong on this channel, but socialism and libertarianism aren't necessarily opposite. There are no binary rights or wrongs with philosophical concepts regarding economics. If you're an American, whether you live in a red...
He's not wrong. He's talking about libertarianism in the European sense, like in the libertarianism in the, not in practice in American political consciousness, but instead, like Noam Chomsky considers himself a libertarian, okay? As a political theory, which would be like an anarchist.
Red state or a blue state or wherever you are on the political compass,
a libertarian
your tax dollars
socialist
subsidize the infrastructure to deliver this video to you. Your tax dollars literally paid for the internet to be developed. It's likely subsidizing the energy you're using and the semiconductors on the device you're watching me on. And then you might begin to ponder the absurdity of paying a bill to a for-profit company to use things that your tax dollars already paid for. And then there are things that are entirely socialized that we don't seem to mind. I don't have any children, but I do pay about $3,000 a year to educate my neighbor's kids, as do most people who pay property taxes. It's not that weird to us, even though our land could be taken away from us by our government if we couldn't afford to pay for other people's education. And it kind of gets jarring when you look at it that way. But there are very few things that you participate in that aren't in some way paid for by other people's tax dollars. The idea that one could live in any developed country and not be enjoying some form of government welfare is delusional. When we think about the government taking over the distribution of media, some of us, myself included,
yeah, it seems like he's he's like Noam Chomsky, libertarian socialist tendencies, not like libertarian like hoorah baby, I love guns.